came unprepared in terms of delivering the paper and in terms of the presentation, because I took you on face value when you sent the email saying that we should come with half-baked or barely baked papers, and that's exactly what I did. In fact, I did it also because I was fully occupied with some other tasks and commitments, and I feel somewhat embarrassed by the state of my paper, but nevertheless. So, and I follow you in terms of the instructions for the presentation as well, which will not be formal. So the way one could identify that economists and policy makers who are inspired by economists have reached by the 1980s and 90s a sort of a consensus about the essential role of institutions, including legal institutions, in the formation and functioning of markets. So we arrived at this consensus in the 1980s. Why did we arrive at that conclusion at that point of time is something which relates to some of the discussions earlier this morning. I guess it's partly an internal economics kind of exercise. You formulate a theory, the theory gets feedback from empirics, the theory doesn't work well, you have to adjust it, so gradually transactions costs and contract theory and property theory and things like this have made some amendments and alterations to the basic neoclassical price theory. It's partly, I guess, because of the context of the time. I think that the collapse of the Soviet Union gave strong impetus to the focus on institutions in the context of what kind of institutions could be brought into Eastern Europe, the Eastern Bloc, in order to promote market economies. It's partly because of some discussions among historians as to the uniqueness of Europe, what can explain the rise of the West or of Western Europe and North America, what was unique in the history of this that gave rise to what one could observe by the 20th century or by the late 20th century. So in terms of the intellectual history of why did this consensus emerge, there is something to be said. And then once this consensus emerged, it became clear that once market economies expand beyond their domain of origins in the West, there's a question of how will institutions be exported or will be transferred to those parts of globe that in a sense aspire to or are being encouraged to aspire to market economy development and to economic growth. And when the institutional economists have reached this question of how do institutions migrate, or how might they migrate in the future, if part of the policy recommendation is to have the kind of European property right institutions, the European contract institutions, the European organizational law, corporate law institutions, and technology-enhancing patent law institutions, and things like this, then the question is, how would this migration take place? And apparently economists did not have any immediate answer to the question. The theory did not prepare them, or the discipline did not well prepare them for this exercise. And I think that what they did was to rely on comparative lawyers, and particularly on those comparative lawyers that dealt with legal transplants of various sorts. And you can see that the references among economists to those comparative lawyers, more so to the comparative lawyers than, let's say, to legal historians or to economic historians. And there was some, in a sense, a lacuna or a shortage in the theoretical framework for the migration of institutions that I encountered in my historical investigations. I'm not a policy person, I'm an historian, and when I was trying to study the migration of institutions, I found a shortage in theory, in theoretical framework, so I, in a way, had to develop my own kind of basic theoretical framework for approaching the case, which was in a way an interaction between history, the history that I've encountered on the one hand, and some theoretical insights that I borrowed mostly from historians of technology, historians of knowledge, historians of science. And using these frameworks, I ended up working on two projects. Each of them had a different focus, but each of them had an element of trying to better understand the migration of market institutions. The first one was a book published some 2 years ago, Going the Distance, Euro-Integration Trade and the Rise of the Business Corporation, 1400 to 1700. So in that book project, I was trying to understand which organizational forms that are relevant for trade, long-distance trade, particularly maritime long-distance trade, were available where, to what extent were they copied by other regions. And the major puzzle I was trying to address is how come the business corporation that served so well some Western European countries, particularly England and the Dutch Republic, did not travel around Eurasia for centuries. Ultimately, it did travel to some extent on some level of depthness, but for at least 2, 3, maybe more than 300 years, it did not travel. So I was trying to figure out how do institutions migrate in a context which is not an imperial context, but rather a context of multiplicity of political units, each of them organized differently, each of them having different interactions with other political units. None of them is dominant in any form that might be found later on when we move to the 19th and 20th century. And I kind of suggested some explanations for why the business corporations did not travel around. I kind of, to some extent, elaborate on this in the paper, to a much larger extent in my book, obviously. My second book, which is still a book in the making, a book project in the making, which is tentatively titled Emperor Limited, Law and the Rise of the Multinationals in the First Era of Globalization, that is roughly between 1844 and 1914, that is from the introduction of general incorporation till World War I. I was trying to study a context which, on the face of it, yields itself much more to the migration of institutions, because we are talking on an expanding empire, the British Empire, that ultimately mastered about a quarter of the globe's population and area, and in theory could command the implementation of corporation law in its various colonies and territories. But even when I studied this case, and in this case of the British Empire, the business corporation seems to be a prime example for something that could be beneficial once implemented around, forming a more unified market, allowing a framework for the investment of capital around the empire. This was an era of massive capital export out of London, the city of London, to the rest of the empire and the rest of the globe. So this field of law, the law, organizational law, and the law of business corporation, was supposed to be very high on the agenda of transplantation of law into the British Empire. But when I studied the actual history of this, I realized that this was also not the case in the British Empire of the time, but rather the history is much more complicated, much more nuanced. In many territories, the law of business corporations was not legislated or implemented at all. In some territories of the empire, it was implemented in a very crude or very basic way, or in a somewhat more anachronistic rather than the cutting edge state in which it was in Britain, but let's say by the 20th century. So based on these two book projects, I was trying to formulate for myself some sort of a framework for studying the migration of legal institutions, legal doctrines. Obviously, in my case, it's only one field of law, but in my view, this field of law is insightful and meaningful, not a minor one, but rather a critical one. And I realized that the story is as much about resistance as it is about transplantation and imposition. It is as much about mutations, about alterations, about the changing of the nature of what is being transplanted from being foreign to being local. It's much about fitting things into the domestic legal frameworks and political frameworks and religious frameworks of different localities. And this is definitely the case outside of the imperial context. And it is correct to some extent also within empires. So the real story is about what's not happening as it is about what's happening. It's about what has changed during the course of the migration of institutions. It's also about titles that seems to be similar, but in fact function totally differently. These things that are being called business corporations are not the same in different parts of the globe. In some cases, they are actually reflecting impersonal collaboration. In some cases, they reflect personally based collaboration. In some places, they reflect some sort of agencies of the state more than that it represents something which is on a sphere, which is separated from the sphere of the state. So I'm in the paper trying to shape this framework, and I feel more or less fine with the framework as much as it is useful for my historical investigation purposes. The question I was trying to address and would like to pose and open up here is how useful is this framework in other contexts or for other users beyond the use of kind of providing some insights for historical investigations. So there is this aspect of an interplay between history and theory, which is a major theme of this conference, which I'm trying to entertain in the paper, and maybe in the future versions I will do it some more. And one of the immediate criticisms of such an interplay between history and theory, I think, is Eurocentrism. That is, you study the history of Europe, and based on this, you're trying to offer a more general, a more universal theoretical framework. And I think that this is often what happens with many theories of economic development. They have a specific case which is considered to be as much as a growth orientation. Growth is the objective, the societal or the political or the economic objective, as much as growth is the objective. One finds growth in Europe and one associates European circumstances to growth. And the question is this totally damageful for the exercise that tries to do this interplay between history and theory, or not, or whether there is no other way to go about with thinking about theory, but through actual historical experience. So that's one question I would like to open up here. Another question which I feel less comfortable kind of addressing myself, but maybe others would like to address, is whether we can draw any policy recommendations, any policy prescriptions, whether we should do it or avoid doing this, given the limitations of the historical investigation and of the theoretical formulation that is based on this historical investigation. And obviously, the policy recommendations are good only as much as one buys into the basic let's say, utility function of a given economy, or the moral economy of the given economy, or the hegemonic ideology, or whatever you call this. So if you prefer some other objectives, obviously this exercise will not be useful. If you are about maximizing stability rather than growth, or if you are about maximizing harmony with nature and minimizing the impact of humanity on the globe, you might have a different view on these things. Or if you put equality as a top objective, even at the expense of growth and standard of living and maybe some sort of living some sort of other objective measurements, let's say, as, for example, life expectancy or whatever, or nutrition, then obviously the policy prescriptions are irrelevant. But if you, to some extent, do endorse growth as objective, what can you say in terms of policy prescriptions, and what can you say which would be more than just trivial? In a sense, things often end up being quite trivial. Things are complex. One cannot achieve economic development without some sorts of political restraint on the government, etc., etc. So I think that I'll stop here. I'll let David take it from here, and I look forward to your questions and suggestions.